Yeah, very good morning to you once again. I'm back here with you with the State of the Nation. This is a program sponsored by the Burnham Foundation, and we normally have this program on the fourth Sunday of each month. Today we're into the festive season, and I want to take this opportunity to wish each and every one of our viewers a happy festive season, because the Christmas day has passed, but we're moving into the new year, and I want to wish you a very happy new year. Today we'll be also observing the 50th anniversary. Let me go that again. The 50th anniversary of the PNC in power. Today mark 50, or this month for that matter, mark 50 years since the PNC was in government. They're not in government today, but it's 50 years of the party's anniversary. So I want to take this opportunity to tell you that we will be looking at some of the conditions under which the PNC came to power, and also to go a little bit into the history of the party. With me in the studio today is Chairman of the Foundation, Mr. Vincent Alexander. We will also be allowing people to make some call-in, wish greetings to your friends and family who have been looking at this program. But I want to bring Mr. Alexander in to give us some background in relation to the PNC acceding to power in Guyana 50 years ago.
Thank you very much, Clayton. First of all, let me join with you in extending greetings to our viewers on this occasion of Christmas. Christmas was Burnham emphasized as the period of the birth of the Christ child rather than a commercial period. You know, we always have to remember the ideas of Burnham on these matters. He was very much into what was referred to as de-emphasizing Christmas, but really what he was de-emphasizing was the commercial aspect of Christmas and allowing the religious aspect to remain dominant. So we are in that season, and I join with you in wishing all Guyanese a very happy festive season. And since we will not be on before the new year, to take the opportunity to wish them all the best in the new year as well. And we hope to continue to be coming into your homes the fourth Sunday of every month in the year 2015. Now today we are focusing on the fact that in 1964, the 14th of December, the People's National Congress acceded to the seat of government, and Lyndon Fobbs Sampson Burnham became the premier of the country at that time. 50 years has gone by, and lots of things have happened since then, and lots of things are not told to the people about that period and about the PNC in government. So the Burnham Foundation finds it almost obligatory to let the public know a bit more about the events leading up to the PNC coming into government and to the events thereafter. We are not in any way fronting for the PNC. We are simply, as a Burnham Foundation, speaking to the ideas of the man who led that party at that time. And today we want to use a tape of a presentation done by Mr. Granger approximately 3 years ago, which we think is rather appropriate because it does speak to the circumstances on which the PNC came into government, because there are lots of distortions about those circumstances. There's a lot of information which is not shared with the public, and so Burnham Foundation, in keeping with its mandate, takes the opportunity to bring this to the nation today. People's National Congress, having come into government on the 14th of December 1964. What were the circumstances then? What contribution did the People's National Congress make, given the circumstances at the time when they came into government?
Excellent. I want to tell our viewers as well that we will also be At the conclusion of this kind of presentation, we will be playing a tape that of a presentation made by the leader of the PNC, Mr. David Granger, approximately some 3 years ago. And we find that very appropriate. So in the circumstance, I want to take this opportunity to keep my mouth quiet, and you can just listen to the presentation. Like Mr. Alexander said, it contains some very interesting and important information that needs to be known to the wider population. So we're going to go straight to the tape. Subsequent to that, we'll invite calls and comments from members of the public.
My task this evening is to paint a portrait of Burnham. Many of us up to now still see Burnham through the eyes of the Western trial, see Burnham through the eyes of other persons. There are about 36 books by Burnham. There are speeches really in the showcase behind there, and there are many more which have not been printed. And I would advise people who are serious about research into Burnham's life to read first and understand. When you are dealing with a person who was born 88 years ago, there are many pitfalls in trying to analyze or assess or examine or evaluate him by present-day standards. You have to carry your mind back to what Guyana was like 88 years ago. Many of us cannot do that. And if we are to judge Burnham, we have to judge him in the context of his times. And let us look briefly at the context, because I wouldn't try to repeat everything my colleagues have said better than I could about his life and work in the field, education, sport, or the economy, or trade unionism. I hope that in my presentation I could give you a framework for analysis, so you can use that framework to analyze various aspects of this man's performance and this man's life and times. Burnham became premier as a 41-year-old Crow Street lawyer. A 41-year-old Crow Street lawyer. He didn't have any pretensions about being a great economist or even a great trade unionist. He knew his limitations, and he tried to recruit always the best persons. In fact, everything he did was covered by law, and he had the two of the best jurists this country has ever seen, Sridhar Ramphal and Mohammed Shahabuddin. He didn't fool around. He didn't fool around with the Attorney General's chambers. He had the best. I wouldn't comment or make comparisons, but he always made sure that he had the best legal brains. He had the best persons qualified in public law occupying that office in Carmichael Street. When you look back at his university days, he spent a lot of time, I think, politicking. And some of you may not know his university performance, but he spent a lot of time in the Caribbean Labour Congress, he spent a lot of time in the West Indies Students' Union, and he spent a lot of time doing what students did other than studying. Even when he came back to Guyana, a lot of his public life was taken up with advocacy of ordinary working people. And the story is told that he had to employ somebody to count the pennies and the cents that workers would pay when he represented them in court. Because, of course, they paid in pennies and cents, and he did a lot of work pro bono. But his main effort, his main contribution was as a politician. He was a member of the Library Committee. You don't know that. He was a member of the Kitty Brotherhood movement. He's a member of the City Council. He was a public man. He was not a private recluse. He was a public person. And when he joined the political movement, he had to fight for his survival. He was not a natural choice. He was not the natural leader. He had to compete for the leadership of the PNC, a tradition that we still hold today. The leadership of the PNC is not there for the taking. I'll tell you that. You have to work for it, and Burnham worked for it. Because the PNC is a very complex party. And when he was running, there were wings in the party, and the right wing perhaps wanted Rawls Farley, or they wanted John Carter. And Burnham had to mobilize support the old-fashioned way and win elections. Nothing came easy. The most important factor, I think, in his political education was what Carl Greenidge mentioned a little while ago, the impact of the disturbances. And I think people who were not born in those days or who did not live through that period would not understand what happened. It's a very complex period, and people like to throw around blame, who did this to whom. But it was very complex. And the problems really started in 1961, after the elections in August, when there was violence and there was the first political murder at Port Morant on the Corentyne coast. Many people don't like to read about that, but A.U.C. Quiner wrote about it in a book called Next Witness. In 1961, the civil servants made certain requests, told in no uncertain terms not a cent more. And the labor problem started to snowball. But what happened on February the 16th, 1962, was not Burnham's doing. If you read all of the text, this was the work of Peter Stanislaus Degar. Burnham was really trying to play catch-up with Degar. It was Degar who turned out the bankers, Degar who turned out Regent Street, Degar who turned out Water Street. Degar was able to put little axes, cardboard axes in people's hands. The PNC couldn't afford that. It was Degar who mobilized the trade unions, because Richard Ishmael, the president of the BGTUC, was a founding member of the United Force. Richard Ishmael, the president of the TUC, was a member of the United Force. And it was Ishmael and Degar who brought about the disturbances in 1962, not Forbes Burnham. Forbes Burnham was trying to play catch-up. And those two men were ahead of the game. They were getting money from some strange sources, not PNC. I can show you some of the leaflets the PNC used to produce in 1962-63, and you would be ashamed. But the party was very poor, and the party did not lead the protests in 1962. Burnham was playing catch-up, because Degar was who was leading the trade unions alongside Richard Ishmael. In 1964, it was Chetty Jagan's show, and he made it quite clear. When he came back from the failed talks, he said, we're going to have a hurricane of protests. And that hurricane started in January with marches from Edinburgh Coast and from Corentyne Coast, which culminated on what used to be the rifle ranges in Georgetown. And then the burning started. And I came from Liverpool on the 1st of August, and Liverpool Village is the birthplace of somebody called Edgar Munro, the cousin of Alan Munro. And he was the first person to be killed in 1964 on the 4th of March. He was killed by a bomb thrown by the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union into a truck at Tain Village on the Corentyne. That is how the disturbances started. And Burnham it was who was calling on his supporters to show patience and show tolerance. In fact, he went to Mrar and said, look, we know you're all in trouble, but take little licks, but not last lick. Take little licks, but not last lick. And he it was who was showing tolerance, while the government refused to call a state of emergency until the British government eventually called a state of emergency after an incident occurred just not far from here in Hatfield Street, when a family was wiped out by a China bomb, by the people who invented China bombs. So when we hear about the disturbances, when we hear about what happened in the 1960s, you must try to understand that Burnham became premier in December 1964 in a messed up country. Internally, he inherited a country that was torn asunder by arson and murder on a scale, as Carl said, which we had never seen before. There was never any sort of political violence in the country. There were refugees. Most of the East Coast public roads on the northern side was wasteland. And the refugees were resettled by the Burnham administration after 1964. That was the sort of reconciliation that was done after the disturbances in 1964. We became independent, comrades, in a state of emergency. We became independent on the 26th of May 1966 in a state of emergency. Our economy was deemed by the British government to be insolvent in December 1964. What sort of country did Burnham take over? That was the sort of country he took over. And you must bear in mind, security policy, when we look at international relations, what was happening around the world? Let me remind you that in 1964, 3 African countries which had gained independence before Guyana, Tanganyika, Uganda, and Kenya, were torn apart by a mutiny by an organization called the King's African Rifles. These new states inherited armies which were trained and officered by the British. And one of the first things these people did was mutiny against the independent government, the newly independent government, for increased wages. That is what the mutiny for. And these 3 independent states had to bring back in the British Army to suppress African mutineers. So you can see when Burnham took over in the same year, 1964, what was going through his mind. I say this because people have made some accusations about me personally, about the role I played. But when I left the GDF, it had a reputation of being the only man on the continent of South America which had never mutinied against the government. And they must understand how that was done. We were a colony, and what happened in a colony? As Carl has told you already, there was not a single African permanent secretary when Burnham took over. There was not a single African pilot in an airplane when Burnham took over. When David Granger left school, he could not get a job in the Royal Bank of Canada. That is the sort of country that Burnham inherited. PNC didn't dominate the public service. People create that impression. The public service was dominated by a different crew who didn't consider themselves black or African. So Burnham took over a country that was internally divided. There was still a state of emergency. People were in preventive detention. Burnham took over a public service which is essentially hostile to him. Burnham took over a country in which the PPP was still conducting violence. There was still arson. There was still sabotage. And one person who was a member of the PYO, who thought he was going on a scholarship to Cuba to study electrical engineering, came back and was so, I can't say courageous, because he died soon afterwards. But he was so candid as to describe the training he got in Cuba. Unfortunately, he was killed soon afterwards. His name is Akbar Ali, and he came from the quarantine. But he's the last person from the PYO who was sort of training they got in Cuba. So that was the sort of situation we took over. It was in the middle of the Cold War. Cuba and Russia were providing guns and money to the PPP during the 1960s. And many persons in the PYO were being sent to Cuba to be trained in guerrilla warfare. That is what happened in Guyana in the 1960s. At the same time, Venezuela revived its claim. I don't need to go into the reasons for that. Cedric Joseph has written an excellent book called Anglo-American Diplomacy, which you should try to read to understand the origins of that territorial problem. The Netherlands, at the same time, revived its claim to the New River, or established a claim to the New River. So Forbes Burnham was faced with a situation of internal insurgency from the People's Progressive Party and external invasion from Venezuela and the Netherlands at that time in Suriname. So we had a territorial problem and we had an external problem. And when we understand that it was Burnham who did most to preserve our territorial integrity, this country would have been much smaller if we had a weaker prime minister than Forbes Burnham. The New River alone is the size of Jamaica. And the part of the country that Venezuela claimed is about the size of Cuba. And Burnham it was who put strategies in place to preserve our territorial integrity. And let me tell you about the New River. I've written about it, I've studied about it. And few of us in uniform, I think, might have been capable of planning a strategic operation the way Burnham did it. Because when we moved in August 1969, the Netherlands was preoccupied with disturbances in Curacao and the Netherlands Antilles, and the whole Netherlands army, the Dutch Royal Army, was deployed in the Caribbean. Inside Suriname itself, there was a governmental crisis. And actually, a civil servant was running the government. Johan Pengel had been thrown out. And the government of Suriname was weak, and the Netherlands was distracted. And that's when Burnham moved. And that's how we all have New River today. That's when Burnham moved. He knew, he understood the strategic scenario perfectly. He negotiated with pilots. And it's all there in the record. Not a secret now. 42 years have passed. He negotiated with the and all the pilots, Roland de Silva, Philip Jardin, Michael Chanasu, Tony McDissy, all of them came together in this country. And Burnham, it was who ran that operation. If we had a weaker man there, we would have been a different shape today, I can tell you that. Another big problem that Burnham faced was the problem of decolonization. I referred to that just now when I was speaking about the King's African people in Tanganyika, Uganda, and Kenya. Again, 4 to 5 years after independence, to understand what we were like in 1966 and why it was necessary to decolonize the country. People's mindset was quite different. The civil service mindset was quite different. Not just a matter of dress, but a matter of loyalty. It's a matter of thinking. You couldn't hear Creole music or Quaker music or folk songs on the radio. You couldn't go to the National Assembly or Legislative Assembly without a tie or a suit. You couldn't get in with certain people. You couldn't work in business places in Water Street without coming from a certain ethnic group. Even now, tell me how many advertisements you see with them in them. Think about that. When you see advertisements of beer or motor cars, ask yourself how many of them have Amerindians, and you could understand what was happening to Indians and Africans 45 years ago. Because this was a very, very different country. A very different country. Decolonization was necessary at the time of independence. On the night of the 26th of May 1966, the Commissioner of Police was a Britisher. The Chief of Staff of the GDF was a Britisher. The Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana was a Canadian. The Bishop of Guyana, the Anglican Bishop, was a Britisher. The Roman Catholic Bishop was a Britisher. The chief executive officers of all of the banks were foreigners. The chief executive officer of the bauxite and sugar industries were all Europeans. This country was not in the hands of Guyanese on the 26th of May 1966. The masses were very, very poor. And this is what Burnham tried to change. He was not satisfied with having a country called Independent Guyana and having it run by depending on foreigners. And he did his utmost to ensure that power was placed in the hands of people who resemble Alyadis. And when you look back at what happened, ask Haslin Paris how old he was when he became CEO of the bauxite company. Ask Ronald Sanders how old he was when he was appointed general manager of the Guyana Broadcasting Corporation. And you'll see the faith that Burnham had in Guyanese and in young people. I won't tell you the ages at the time. But the point I'm making is that Burnham moved to decolonize Guyana. In fact, the PNC established something called the Institute of Decolonization. Remember that, Oscar? the Institute of Decolonization, the INDECOL. And this was the institute that produced plans for transferring ownership of Guyana into Guyanese hands. He believed in Guyanese, and he believed that anything the foreigners could do, Guyanese could do as well, if not better. And we can read, you heard what happened there from Carl. Something that he believed in. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation in which Guyana became independent, and Forbes Burnham was the man with the vision. He saw the transformation of Guyana. He saw placing power in the hands of ordinary people, in the hands of their representatives, in the hands of young people. We set up our own judiciary. We appointed a chancellor of the judiciary long before other Caribbean countries thought about abandoning the Privy Council. He set up a Guyana Defense Force. And even though I have criticized some of the mistakes he made in setting up the Guyana Defense Force, for example, the abolition of the British Guyana Volunteer Force. In fact, when he was planning the Guyana Defense Force, he took advice from who he thought was a military expert and abolished the volunteer force. 10 years later, he had to set back up the People's Militia, but he realized his mistake, although it interrupted my university education. He had to start a foreign service from scratch. And he had the benefit of recruiting some of our finest academics into the foreign service. People like Cedric Joseph came from the university. People like Cedric Grant came from the university. People like Robert Moore. People like Barton Scotland. We had a foreign service which was the envy of the Caribbean, which was the envy of the non-aligned movement, which was the envy of the third world. Comparisons with the present are odious. We set up a national insurance scheme, although we have records of defaulters now. But he set up a national insurance scheme to protect workers. It was he who built the University of Guyana campus. People do not know that. But as part of the independence celebrations in May 1966, he received an open plot of land from Sir Jack Campbell and built that campus we see now. Forbes Burnham, he took possession of an open plot of land and built what you see now as the University of Guyana. He passed the Amerindian Act. He passed the National Security Act, which did away with the state of emergency that he inherited from the British. In international relations, again, I cannot cover the whole gamut because of time. He went into office in December, was it December the 7th, Oscar? December the 7th, 1964. Would you believe that by December the 5th, 1965, 1 year and 1 week after Forbes Burnham entered office, Dickinson Bay Agreement was signed establishing the Caribbean Free Trade Area? What sort of man is this? 1 year after he enters office for the first time, he was able to bring about the Caribbean Free Trade Area, which jump-started Caribbean integration. So committed he was. 1 year and a week after. That was the sort of man he was. He went to see Very Bird. He went to see Errol Barrow and the Three Bs. I remember that because I was a journalist at the time, and I wrote an essay called The Three Bs, the Three Busy Bees, Burnham, Barrow, and Bird, who set up the Caribbean Free Trade Area. He didn't wait on Jamaica. He didn't wait on Trinidad. He said, catch me if you can. And he and Barrow set up the first joint high commission in London. Barbados and Guyana had a joint high commission. So committed he was to Caribbean integration. And his first wife, as you know, was Trinidadian too. So we see a man who's driven by a passion for Caribbean integration, driven by a passion for his country, driven by passion for Guyanization. If he had any fault, perhaps, is that he placed too much faith in some of the people he appointed. He thought some of them shared the same vision that he did, and I think that led to grief. So, I would like to be brief. I'd like to sum up very quickly. Burnham was the best person to lead Guyana to independence. As Victor Hugo said, and I paraphrase him, these are not his exact words, no power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come. And Burnham was that idea, and Burnham's time came on the 7th of December 1964. He who led us out of the dark night of the disturbances, and it's he who gave us the self-confidence and the self-esteem of being an independent nation. As I said, and as Carl pointed out, we inherited an economy in tatters, and we restored economic viability. PPP does not talk about these 7 years from 1957 to 1964. But there was a commission of inquiry by the British into the state of the economy and to the financial status of this country under the PPP. And we were insolvent as of the 7th of December 1964. He had to restore social stability after the country had been torn apart. And that is why when I went to Horodaya on the 6th of July last, I insisted that that event, that location should be used for national reconciliation. Because Burnham's philosophy was that we should not try to make capital out of the sufferings of people in those disturbances. And he aimed at reconciliation. And some family members were baffled. Why the PNC commemorating this event? But he didn't want to make that a bone of division. He did not want to make that an obstacle to national unity. He wanted instead to introduce holidays for the Hindus, introduce holidays for the Muslims, and to bring our people together. He it was who pioneered Caribbean integration after it had collapsed in 1962. Trinidad went ahead with independence, Jamaica went ahead with independence, and 11 years later, he was one of the 4 signatories to the agreement at Chaguaramas, which re-established the Caribbean community. And that, it was in tribute to Burnham, that a country whose shores are not washed by the Caribbean Sea became the home of the Caribbean Community Secretariat. And the other leaders made it clear, this is for you, for we know that you have committed your life's work to making the Caribbean community possible. And we're not going to fight that on Barbados. Guyana is going to have the headquarters for the Caribbean community. We were an internationally recognized country. I remember my sister-in-law going to Zambia, because when Zambia became independent, it didn't have typists. It didn't have stenographers. And Kenneth Kaunda came down here asking for help. And from the little that he had, Burnham gave to Zambia. And he sent typists and stenographers because the British pulled out of what was called Northern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia. It was the Federation of Nyasaland, and it broke up into 3 states, Malawi, Zambia, and the present-day Zimbabwe. And Kenneth Kaunda asked for help, and Burnham gave help. When South Africa was in trouble, when Namibia was in trouble, from the little that we had, Burnham gave help, financial help, all that we could give to help the frontline states. But we had a foreign service then, which could be depended on by the non-aligned movement and by colonial territories to stand up on the side of the oppressed people. As Faith explained, it was Burnham who introduced the state paper on equality for women all of 35 years ago in 1976. Burnham established a youth division. Burnham used to celebrate Youth Week. Every May we celebrated Youth Week in this country because of the priority he gave to youth. Not only was there a youth division, but he established a youth corps. Why? Because the economy inherited from the People's Progressive Party after 7 years left a huge pool of unemployed youth. And the youth corps, which was established at Tumachimari, was meant to provide employment for young people. That was done by Forbes Burnham. He cared about youth. Burnham also cared about workers. He it was who supported the construction of the Critchlow Labour College, and he respected trade unionists. Burnham respected the law. Many people don't understand that. They accuse Burnham of all sorts of things. Burnham never broke the law. If he didn't agree with the law, he changed the law. Or if he felt the law was stupid, as sometimes you have stupid laws, a new law was passed, and then he obeyed the law. But when you look back at what Burnham did, he never broke the law. And he made sure he had two good attorney generals to make sure he didn't. So what we see of Forbes Burnham is not a smart man. He's not a tyrant, not a dictator, not an autocrat. A man who listened. A man who made mistakes and learned from the mistakes. A man who consulted, but a man who was always driven by a passion to do good for the people of Guyana. He wouldn't allow himself to be fooled. He went to Suriname to meet Johan Pengel because he knew there was a problem. He went to two fat men meeting. He went to Pengel and he tried to work out a deal with Pengel. And Pengel wouldn't. Pengel continued to send people into the New River, continued to send defense elements into the New River until August 1969, Burnham decided to stop the intrusion. He was a socialist. From his early days in the Students' Union, he said he was a socialist, and he never stopped being a socialist. And people misunderstand that socialism. It is not something he read of in a book. When he was in Britain, he lived and studied under a man called Clement Attlee. And almost every month, Attlee was nationalizing something. Coal was nationalized. The railways were nationalized. Health was nationalized. And in those days, people did feel that the state could run these institutions more efficiently than private enterprise, because they felt private enterprise was rapacious. And that was the sort of education he got as a student. He met people like Abubakar Tafawa Balewa and Kwame Nkrumah and C.L.R. James in London. And this was the thinking. Anti-colonialism, socialism. And this is what he brought back. This was the zeitgeist. This is what the thinking was. Nowadays, people criticize socialism, but that was the thinking in those days, and he remained a socialist until he died. He was an avid trade unionist. He was a Tutro leader of the Guyana Labor Union. It was an honorific post. He was really elected because he met Hubert Critchlow in his father's house in Kitty. That is where he met Critchlow, in his father's house. Critchlow says, look, we need people like you in the trade union movement. And Burnham went into the trade union movement with the stevedores, and people laughed at him. Why a nice lawyer like you going by the trade, going by the waterfront? You don't have any ambition? And that was his ambition, to do good for the workers. So we see in Forbes Burnham what I would call a complete Guyana, in deference to my colleague, a complete Guyana person. He was arguably the greatest Guyanese and the fittest person to lead us into independence. Today, on the 5th of August, the day before the 26th anniversary of his death, we salute his memory and his legacy. He is remembered in the words of people like Robert Montgomery Prasad, who still speak about feeding the nation. He's remembered in the words of Muhammad Irfan Ali, who still speak about housing the nation. I'm not my words. In fact, people who read that legend would know that Ali Baba was the man who was opposed to the 40 thieves. Ali Baba was not a thief. Ali Baba was, read the legend carefully. but I'm not here to help the illiterate. I do hope tonight, as I congratulate the Forbes Burnham Foundation, and as I thank you for all of you for coming out tonight, I do hope tonight that this simple symposium has helped to rekindle interest in the life and times of Forbes Burnham. Let us put aside our prejudices. Let us put aside the propaganda. Read his works. Try to understand what he did, and you'd realize what a greater man walked among us. He didn't call himself a god. He was not a demigod. He didn't say he didn't make mistakes. He's a very human person, and he listened to advice. But in so doing, he helped to launch a nation which was independent and which there was a high level of self-esteem, and a nation which I look forward to leading after the elections.
Yes, that was a good piece. I trust that our viewers have been paying attention to those words. Very short presentation by the leader of the PNC and the majority leader in Parliament, the Honorable Mr. David Granger. Vincent, your comments. Just before, of course, I want to tell our viewers that the lines are open. You can make a call, make a comment. We still have some minutes. You can make a contribution in relation to the presentation by Mr. Granger, and also to send greetings to your members of your family and other relatives, both in Guyana and out of Guyana. Yes, Vincent, your comments on the presentation.
There are some important points that were made in that presentation. Some are inferred and some are very explicit. Well, the first one I want to observe is that between 1961 and 1964, the first peaceful Christmas that we had was in 1964, just 11 days after the PNC came into government. The Christmas of 61, 62, 63 were all troubled Christmases. In 64, we could see the return to peace. The peace is associated with the Christ child. And so that's the first point I want to make to those who do not know our history. In addition to that, I want to make the observation that was made, that in 64, the country was insolvent. People behave as if this is the only era that this country has made money. And that, people infer that it was under the PNC that the country had problems. In 64, we inherited a country that was insolvent. And between 64 and 68, you can speak to the prosperity that came under the People's National Congress. So you can't wipe the People's National Congress with a broad brush. Because you can also speak of the period 1985 to 1992, when under the leadership of Mr. Hoyt and the People's National Congress, the country was returned to a part of growth and development. And it's that part of growth and development that the present regime has built on. And so these are facts that one must be able to lay bare. 64 to 68, insolvency in 64, growth and development up to 68. We did have problems in the early 70s into the 80s, partly attributed to the international situation,
the oil crisis and so on.
The oil crisis and so forth, attributed to the retribution for the strong position we took in terms of the direction we wanted to go in, and not just blame the PNC like that. For example, the whole question of nationalization. Many do not know that Burnham was not initially an advocate of nationalization. It was Chelly Jagan who was an advocate of nationalization. Burnham was an advocate of controlling the commanding heights of the economy. And when he started the negotiations were to acquire 51% of those industries, not to nationalize. He eventually nationalized, given the response of the companies and under pressure, internal pressure of Chelly Jagan.
I want to take this call. I see some of our viewers. Yes, you're on here.
Yes, morning.
Yes, morning.
I appreciate what Mr. Granger do because I live in those days. I know what he said. But he was trying to keep our country at 86,000 square miles. But right now, as how things going, soon we even got 6 square miles because there's the Chinese and the Spanish owning. You can remember that calypso, not a blade of grass?
Yes.
That was New River, and he stood up for it. When the Venezuelans come, he stood up for it. But right now, they were fighting to take, but we are giving now. We are not fighting to keep, neither to take, but we are fighting to give. Soon we are not going to have anything.
All right, thanks for your call.
Bye. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Vincent, you were saying.
Yeah, so we were saying that the whole nationalization thing was something that Jenny Jagan propagated. Burnham was in the first instance for controlling commanding heights, controlling, not owning the commanding heights. And so there's a lot of distortion in the history and people not taking responsibility for things that they propagated and for the way in which Burnham incorporated them in his decision-making process.
Morning, Andy. Take your...
Good morning.
Yeah, morning, sir.
I appreciate what you're doing on the television.
Okay.
And
Thank
I
you.
like Mr. Alexander to do more of this work that he's doing. Because the young people need to educate a lot about Burnham. And I know he's the man with the history. And if you know, he will know his voice. And I want you to keep on the good work.
Okay.
All right.
All right, thank you.
Have a good season.
Yes, Vincent, yeah.
Yes, so it's important for us to understand how our history has unfolded over the years and not to be subject to this purely partisan exposures which we are having, which do not tell the full and
Story.
the true story. For example, the issue of the disturbances, and Mr. Granger spoke about the first death in Post Laurent. And lots of people do not know about the Monroe death. Lots of people do not know about what happened in Buxton, what happened with the son Chapman, and the fact that even though there were problems in Linden, it resulted from those incidents.
Morning, you're on here.
There was no death
Hello,
in
good
Linden.
morning, guys,
Morning.
and season greetings to you.
Thank you very much. And
And I really do appreciate what it is that you guys are doing there. But just want to reflect a little on what Mr. Granger had said and the contributions you guys are making. It has to do with border issues. Now, no way on the face of the earth has we ever seen this. A big, powerful Venezuela not being able to take not a blade of grass. It is our lived experience that we've been able to preserve the borders and to keep our nation safe. And it is all comes down to the whole attitude, the
quality of leadership.
attitude of the leadership.
Yes, that's
in
right.
Bob Sampson word. And we must not take it for granted that when we live here and we don't know of any murders, they haven't taken away anything. And it was just him. And even the great diplomats, even out of Venezuela, they usually do admire us as to how we stood up and dealt with it.
Okay.
And I say to you guys, keep the job up.
Okay, thank you very much. And season greetings to you and your family.
You too. Thank you.
Yes. Some significant point by Mr. Granger. He spoke about where Mr. Burnham, after independence, established a youth department, a youth office responsible directly to youth. Those are significant kind of decisions. Passing of the Amerindian Act, those are significant independence agreement with the British, which he had to stick to. Those, it sounds as though it's simple today, but those are very significant kind of milestone.
They are indeed. You know, the Amerindian Act one must look at in particular because there is this view that the Amerindians will only be benefited. Now, I've even heard government officials say that there were no secondary schools in the hinterland.
But I heard
prior
that
to
one
now.
too.
I mean, the thing is so blatant that one can easily point to St. Ignatius, which existed,
Mabaruma
Babilonian Secondary, which has existed, the establishment of the Burma Agricultural Institute in Port
in
Kaituma,
Arakaka. In Arakaka.
Arakaka. So you have these instances of schools in the hinterland. I'm not saying there aren't more now, but to say blatantly to this nation that no secondary schools existed, I mean, what's the need for that? You know, if one is confident in what one is doing. It's
Morning, you're on here.
people.
Yeah, greetings to each and every one of you.
Yeah, greetings, sir.
I am an ex-Bonamite.
Ex-Burnham.
Yes, I'm
Okay.
from National Service.
All right.
And I hope and pray they could bring back National Service. Because if you check the prison system today, all our youth is there, all our foundation, our dream home.
But I agree. I can agree with you more because it boils down to leadership.
Yes.
If the people who lead in doesn't have the sense and vision to put in place those mechanisms, then we're going to be continuing marking time and not moving.
Exactly. So I appreciate this situation. I came for this program could be more prompted with it.
Okay.
Twice a month to educate the youths of this generation, because the youths of this generation today do not have no knowledge, no history, because they're being blindfolded from the history of Mr. Bonham. Everybody talking about the PPP, this and that, but they don't look back what Mr. Bonham did. Mr. Bonham saved me. I was a street youth. When I get caught, I was placed in national service. I never regretted the day. I raised a family with Mr. Bonham Morale in my home. I have 7 children. I have no criminals.
Okay.
And I appreciate the knowledge that was exposed. Even Mr. Alexander down there, he was once our guidance Mr. Fire and these things.
Okay.
Even Mr. Tikoff. I used to walk yards by these Mr. Ali's minister's place, because I was there, very interested with military and trade. Mr. Sherry Austin was my cousin, so he was there to make sure I get a trade and educate myself properly. So what we need to do is bring back an institution to take these youths out of the misery, because the youth is the future. And if we could destroy the youth today, we have no future left.
All right. Thank you very much.
Respect.
Okay. Enjoy the season.
You too.
I think an important point is the national service point. You know, when people speak of national service today, they give the impression that all national service was about was a compulsory 1-year university students had to serve. But in fact, the university students were a minor aspect and a minority of national service. The larger aspect of national service was a voluntary engagement of young people who were looking for a second chance. And I think we need to emphasize that. It was a voluntary engagement. There was no compulsion about going to national service for those large number of young people. It was an opportunity which a number of them took, and today there are many of them who could attest to the fact that this opportunity
benefited them.
Even people like Jerry Gavile, people like Ram Sarup can tell you what national service did in terms of their growth and their development.
Fashioning their character. Morning on here. We're running out of time, but I will allow you.
Season greetings, sir.
Season greetings to you, sir.
I want to make one observation. You know, I've attended a couple of these forums, the last one at Queen's College.
Yes.
And I recognize that there is some diminution of Barnum's role in education at these presentations. Barnum was the first Minister of Education in this country in the 53 government. And even though he was not Minister of Education in the 64 government, the wind under the wings of education was put there by Barnum. And all of the pluses that we experience today is generally because of the education policy that Barnum put into place. You know, I listened to an interview with Barnum in those days, and a foreigner asked him if Guyana could afford free education, and he said the question should be whether Guyana cannot afford free education.
Interesting.
I myself, in 64, used to cook for some people on a lunch, right? And when free education came in, I was beneficiary of that. And not only me, many of the persons who are criticizing Barnum today are beneficiaries of Barnum's free education program. The president, I think, is one of them. You know? So I would like that when we have forums like these, there should be greater emphasis on the role that Barnum played in education. Mr. Granger said that when we became independent, we did not have all of these public servants. We don't have pilots. They were all foreigners, you know. Not merely because we perhaps did not have the people in the country who can do this work, but many of them have migrated because there were no opportunities.
The opportunities were not created.
Were not. But on the Burnham, when the opportunities came, and we gave Philip to achieving the kind of status, the kind of education ability, you had all these people coming back and people emerging from our situation. So I'd like that to be emphasized some more when we're discussing these things.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much for your contribution. And I want to say to our viewers that we're running out of time.
Okay.
I want to just give Mr. Alexander an opportunity to round up based on the presentation that Mr. Granger has given, and also to say to our viewers, I hope that you have an excellent Old Year's Night party coming into New Year. For 2015 will be a successful year for everyone. Yes, Vincent.
Well, as we come down to the end of 2014, the Burnham Foundation found it opportune to bring to the nation's attention the fact that 50 years ago, the PNC acceded to the seat of government, and to give some information surrounding what was the circumstance at the time, what they were able to do subsequent to coming into government, and the contribution that they made. Notwithstanding the era of problems that they might have had in the 70s and the 80s, if one wants to be truthful, on the landscape of this country's history, one cannot deny significant contribution of the PNC. Much of it has not been covered in today's program, but certainly we have emphasized the role of Lyndon Fobbs Sampson Burnham in taking the nation out of conflict into peace in 1964. And separating apart from the spate of extrajudicial killings and things like that of recent time, the country has been a relatively peaceful country.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Vincent. I think that on that note we might have to close because our time is up, and I want to tell you that on the 4th Sunday of January we'll be back here again to bring to your attention another program on the state of the nation. I'm your host, Clayton Hines, thanking you for being with me all year. And I hope that we will continue along the same path. Hopefully we might be able to increase our program to maybe 2 per month. But for the time being, we'll have to continue. Of course, you know, funding is a problem for the foundation. Those of you who have been associated with us would know that. But we are prepared here to have the legacy of Fobbs Burnham alive, keeping it alive, and his ideas and views. We try to make sure that we impart information to the nation on the role and the contribution that this stalwart of Guyana and the Caribbean has made towards the development of Guyana. Once again, I thank you for being with me today. Till next month when I see you once again on another program of the State of the Nation.